You may have heard adrenaline and associated it with roller coasters and stress, but what actually is adrenaline? Let's talk about it. I'll see you inside. Adrenaline is actually a hormone that's produced in response to the need to increase movement and attention. For example, we actually have a lot of adrenaline immediately upon waking up, and this is in order to increase our attention and to increase our movement to begin the day. And the production of adrenaline actually occurs in the adrenal medulla, which is a portion of the adrenal gland. And the adrenal gland is simply just a gland located on the top of the kidneys, responsible for the production of a lot of hormones. And now, to get extremely specific, there are actually a subsection of cells inside the adrenal gland called chromaffin cells that will make, store, and secrete adrenaline. However, to actually signal for adrenaline to be pushed into the bloodstream, the first signal comes from the hypothalamus. And now, the hypothalamus does not actually send a signal directly to the adrenal gland. It will actually send a signal to the spinal cord in a region called the ganglia. And now, the ganglia is referred to as the sympathetic portion of the spinal cord. And now, the spinal cord is actually referred to as the presynaptic neuron, meaning that it has a neuron that will send a signal to a postsynaptic neuron. And this postsynaptic neuron is located on the adrenal gland. So the hypothalamus will actually signal to the spinal cord to produce and secrete acetylcholine. And now this process is pretty simple. We take acetyl-CoA and choline and use an enzyme called choline acetyltransferase and produce acetylcholine. We then store it inside of a vesicle and, for lack of a better word, send it down to the adrenal gland. So the acetylcholine vesicle will bind to the membrane of the presynaptic neuron and release the acetylcholine into the synapse, which is the space between the presynaptic neuron and the postsynaptic neuron. And then this acetylcholine will bind to a very specific receptor on the adrenal gland called the nicotinic receptor. And the acetylcholine will actually bind to a specific group of cells on the adrenal gland called chromaffin cells. And it will bind to a specific receptor called the nicotinic receptor. And when it binds to this receptor, this opens up what's referred to as a sodium channel, which simply just lets sodium ions enter into the chromaffin cells. And now, inside of these chromaffin cells, we actually have adrenaline stored in another vesicle. But in order to get this vesicle to actually release the adrenaline, we need to get past what's referred to as the action potential. And this is simply a specific voltage that's required inside of the neuron for it to go through what's called depolarization, which is simply just the act of releasing the stored neurotransmitters. And the way that sodium helps with this is because sodium has a positive charge, meaning it will increase the voltage or positivity of the cell. And when the positivity begins to increase, it opens what's referred to as voltage-gated calcium channels. And these sodium channels will actually open up what are referred to as voltage-gated calcium channels. And the calcium also has a positive charge, increasing the voltage more, and calcium has an additional function. So on the membrane and on the vesicle containing the adrenaline, there are what are referred to as snare proteins. And in order to get the vesicle to actually bind to the membrane, these snare proteins need to attach to one another. And calcium is actually what allows this action to occur. So the calcium causes the vesicle to bind to the membrane of the neuron and release the stored adrenaline into the bloodstream. And now you may ask, how did the adrenaline even get there in the first place? It actually all started with a single amino acid called tyrosine. Tyrosine becomes L-DOPA. L-DOPA becomes dopamine. Dopamine is turned into noradrenaline, and noradrenaline is converted into adrenaline. And now your ears may have perked up when you heard the word dopamine. It is true that when your dopamine levels increase, you actually will have a subsequent increase in adrenaline because the dopamine is turned into noradrenaline and then adrenaline. And this is kind of interesting because when you produce dopamine, you will actually increase your motivation to take action towards a specific reward. And then the adrenaline that is produced downstream of dopamine will actually give you the physical and mental capability to do so. And now, this is how adrenaline is typically produced inside of the adrenal gland. However, it can also be produced outside of the adrenal gland. Instead of connecting to the adrenal gland, some of those ganglia in the spinal cord actually connect to receptors that directly stimulate a specific organ. What I mean by this is the ganglia will actually send neurotransmitters directly to a specific tissue, like the heart, lungs, and the muscles. And actually, on the membrane of these muscles, there is the same nicotinic receptor. So acetylcholine will bind and the adrenaline will be produced there. And when it's produced in the adrenal gland, the adrenaline will simply travel to these tissues instead of being directly stimulated. But regardless of whether or not adrenaline was brought to the tissue directly or was taken there indirectly through the bloodstream, adrenaline will have the same effects on the tissue no matter where it came from. With that being said, different tissues actually have different reactions to this epinephrine molecule. And I apologize if I may have confused you. Epinephrine and adrenaline are the exact same thing. It is simply just a difference between how they say it in the US and how they would say it in the UK. So adrenaline exudes its effects through a G protein coupled receptor pathway. And now you may have heard me talk about this kind of receptor when I was talking about other hormones, because this type of receptor is very common for intracellular signaling. So the G protein receptor sits on the outside of the membrane, and attached on the inside of the membrane are some proteins. And when adrenaline binds to the G protein receptor, one of the proteins is released and activates a specific enzyme called the adenylyl cyclase enzyme. And this turns ATP into a new molecule called cyclic AMP. And then cyclic AMP will actually activate a molecule called pKa. And as you may remember, pKa is what makes the magic happen. So inside of cells, we have these phosphate molecules that we kind of just attach to different enzymes, and it either turns on or turns off the enzymes. And pKa is the main molecule that does this, what's called phosphorylation process. And inside of the liver, it actually phosphorylates the molecules that are responsible for turning the stored glycogen into glucose. It also will phosphorylate the enzymes responsible for turning amino acids from protein and glycerol from fatty acids into glucose. This process is called gluconeogenesis, and the process of turning the stored glycogen into glucose is called glycogenolysis. And then that glucose is pushed into the bloodstream where it can be used by other cells to produce energy. And the cells and tissue that actually uptake this glucose are typically the working cells, such as the muscle if we're trying to move, or the brain if we're trying to think and focus. And now this is how it acts on the liver, but if we move to the adipose or fat tissue, it binds to the same type of receptor, but the enzymes that it actually stimulates are the ones that will liberate stored triglycerides and push them into the bloodstream. And the fatty acids can be used for fuel, and that glycerol molecule can go to the liver, where, as I discussed, is turned into glucose. And the other subtype of cells I'll discuss are the beta-adrenergic cells. And these are simply cells that have a specific receptor called the beta-adrenergic receptor. And the location of these receptors and cell types is typically on the heart. And these beta-adrenergic receptors are most abundant on the heart. And when they bind to the receptors on the heart, the result is an increase in heart rate and an increase in blood pressure. So the beta-adrenergic receptor on the heart will actually increase the heart rate and cause the heart to push out more blood. There are also beta-adrenergic receptors on blood vessels. And this is where adrenaline will bind to and cause our blood vessels to contract. And this will also increase our blood pressure. What you can think is that the contraction of our blood vessels gives blood a smaller tube to run through, meaning the outwards pressure that is resulting from blood flow is greater. And then we can move to the kidneys. And the contraction of the blood vessels actually decreases the output of urine, which is very important because, as we mentioned, this adrenaline molecule is produced during times of stress, and during times of stress is not the best time to take a bathroom break. And now the last beta-adrenergic receptor I'll talk about are the bronchial cells on the lungs. And now, in this case, it actually causes the dilation or expansion of these cells. And the reason for this is because it actually allows the lungs to uptake more oxygen and output more carbon dioxide. And this is why our breathing rate can increase if we have extremely high adrenaline. So as you can tell, the functions of adrenaline are diverse and many. However, all of these functions allow us to move better and pay better attention to our environment. If we gave ourselves an adrenaline pill, it would be like exercising without actually going through the movement. So I hope you found this information informative and interesting, and I hope you tune in to next episode. I want to say thank you for listening and have a great